2:10 in the afternoon. The first wave of 60 Iranian Shahed drones launched from the jagged cliffs near Bandar Abbas. This was not a routine provocation of the American fleet. The density of the radar contacts suggested a saturation curve that no single ship could survive. The question was whether the machines could kill the threat faster than the threat could arrive. The heat over the Strait of Hormuz was a physical weight. The water below was a dull and oily green. At the center of the horizon, the USS Abraham Lincoln moved with a slow and deceptive grace. It was the heart of a carrier strike group. Its destroyers and cruisers were positioned like chess pieces in a defensive array. The morning had been calm. The afternoon was turning into a crisis. The Combat Information Center was a room of shadows and hums. It was the nerve center of the fleet. Admiral Sarah Vance stood behind the primary tactical display. The air conditioning was set to 60 degrees. She could still feel the sweat on the back of her neck. The tactical action officer spoke first. "Admiral, we have a massive radar anomaly. Bearing 045. It is not a single flight." Vance stepped closer to the glass. "Explain the return." The officer pointed at a blooming cloud of yellow icons. "It is a swarm. They are flying low. Their radar signatures are overlapping. It looks like a carpet of drones." "Give me a count," Vance asked. The officer checked his terminal. "Initial estimate is 60. Wait. More launches from the island of Keshem, and more from the eastern coast. They are coming from 3 directions simultaneously." 40 miles to the north, the Iranian controllers sat in a bunker cooled by industrial fans. General Massoud watched the screen. He was a man who understood the value of numbers. He knew the limitations of the American computers. The general spoke to his lead technician. "The synchronization must be perfect. If they arrive in a line, they will be killed one by one. If they arrive as a cloud, they will win." The technician replied, "The swarm logic is active. The units are communicating with each other. They are adjusting their speeds to ensure a simultaneous arrival." Back on the Lincoln, the count hit 200. The room went silent. 200 drones meant 200 problems. The math of the Gulf was breaking. The carrier had 4 close-in weapon systems. Each one was a radar-guided Gatling gun. They were the last line of defense. These systems were designed to handle dozens of threats. They were not designed for hundreds. Admiral Vance looked at her screen. "Signal the escorts. Tell the destroyers to prepare for a multi-axis engagement. We are moving to general quarters. We are moving to general quarters." The alarm began to scream through the steel hallways of the carrier. Thousands of sailors moved to their stations. The massive ship began to bank into a hard turn. The sea churned white behind the propellers. The sky was still clear and blue. There was no smoke yet. There were no explosions. There was only the sound of the wind and the steady ticking of the radar. The American crew watched the yellow cloud grow. Each icon represented a cheap piece of plastic and explosives. Together, they represented a force that could paralyze a billion-dollar warship. The admiral knew that the next 10 minutes would define her career. They might also define the future of the region. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 2:15 in the afternoon. The radar screens inside the Combat Information Center of the Abraham Lincoln turned into a blizzard of data. The Aegis combat system was working at its maximum processing limit. It was designed to track hundreds of targets simultaneously. But these targets were behaving with a strange and collective intelligence. They were not flying in predictable paths. They were weaving and changing altitude in perfect synchronization. The tactical action officer adjusted his headset. "Admiral, the swarm is dividing. They are forming 3 distinct tiers. One group at 500 feet, one at 1,000, one at 2,000. They are trying to force our sensors to scan multiple elevations at once." Vance watched the yellow icons. They were now 35 miles away and closing. "Get the Stockdale on the line." 2:18 in the afternoon. The USS Stockdale, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, moved into its picket position 5 miles ahead of the carrier. The ship was a wall of sensors and missiles. Its commander spoke over the secure radio link. "Lincoln, this is Stockdale. We have a solid track on the lead elements. We are seeing high levels of electronic interference. The drones are emitting a low-power jamming signal. It is not enough to black out our radar, but it is enough to make a precise lock difficult. Admiral Vance responded. Stockdale. Understood. Do not waste your long-range missiles on these targets. They cost $2 million apiece. The drones cost $20,000. We cannot win a war of attrition. Wait for the 5-mile line. The commander of the Stockdale was professional. Copy. Holding for close-in engagement. But Admiral, there are simply too many of them. If even 5% get through, they will reach the flight deck. 2:20 in the afternoon. The tactical officer pointed to a secondary display. It showed a simulation of the defensive fire. Admiral, the math is not on our side. The Phalanx close-in weapons system is our best hope. It can fire 75 rounds per second, but each mount only holds 1,500 rounds. That is 20 seconds of fire before a manual reload is required. If the swarm hits us all at once, the guns will run dry while targets are still in the air. Vance looked at the screen. The drones were now 30 miles away. What about the electronic warfare suite? Can we sever their link to the ground? The electronic warfare officer shook his head. Negative. They are not using a traditional radio link. They are using an autonomous mesh network. Each drone talks to the drone next to it. You cannot jam the signal, because the signal is everywhere. You would have to jam the entire sky. Inside the Iranian bunker, General Massoud watched the countdown. His plan was working. He was not looking for a kill. He was looking for the threshold. He wanted to see exactly when the American system would stop being a weapon and start being a computer that was frozen by too much information. He turned to his command team. Initiate Phase 2. Increase the speed of the second wave. I want them to overlap with the first. On the bridge of the Lincoln, the wind began to howl as the carrier reached 30 knots. The massive ship felt small against the approaching cloud. The sensors began to chirp with a new, higher frequency. It was the sound of a system that was starting to lose its grip on the situation. The first drone crossed the 20-mile mark. It was a small, white shape against the hazy horizon. It was the first of many. 2:25 in the afternoon. The Iranian Coastal Command Center near Bandar Abbas was a hive of quiet intensity. General Massoud stood before a wall of monitors that mirrored the chaos he was creating in the sky. To the Americans, this was an act of war. To the general, it was a mathematical proof. He was testing the saturation point of the most advanced naval force on the planet. The general turned to his lead flight controller. Are the units in the third wave maintaining their intervals? The controller nodded. Yes, General. The mesh network is distributing the processing load. Each drone is adjusting its throttle to maintain the cloud density. We are currently presenting 212 distinct radar signatures to the American fleet. Massoud looked at the tactical map. The blue icons of the American carrier strike group were clustered together. They were a fortress of steel and silicon, but every fortress has a limit. They will try to prioritize. They will look for the lead drones. Command the swarm to cycle the leadership roles every 30 seconds. No single drone should remain at the front of the formation. 2:28 in the afternoon. On the bridge of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the atmosphere was clinical and cold. Admiral Vance watched the latest data from the E-2 Hawkeye circling high above the fleet. The airborne early warning aircraft was feeding a high-resolution picture to every ship in the group. The tactical action officer spoke with a measured tone. Admiral, the swarm is exhibiting a high degree of coordination. They are not just flying in a line, they are rotating. It is a shell game. Our targeting computers are struggling to maintain a consistent track on individual units because the units keep switching positions. Vance leaned over the console. They are trying to burn our processing cycles. If the computer has to recalculate the solution every 30 seconds, it can never clear the queue. What is the range? The officer checked the laser rangefinder data. 15 nautical miles and closing. Speed is 110 knots. Time to the outer engagement envelope is 5 minutes. A screen to the left flashed red. It was a communication from the Pentagon. The National Command Authority was watching the feed in real time. The Admiral ignored it for a moment. Her world was now restricted to the 30 miles of ocean surrounding her ship. The commander of the air wing spoke into his headset. Admiral, I have 2 F-35 fighters on the deck, ready for immediate launch. We can use their internal cannons to thin the herd before they reach the destroyers. Vance shook her head. Negative. If we launch now, we put pilots in the middle of a friendly fire zone. Once the destroyers start throwing metal into the air, anything with a cockpit is at risk. Keep the fighters on the deck. We rely on the Aegis system and the Phalanx mounts. 2:30 in the afternoon. The tension was no longer a feeling. It was a physical pressure in the room. The drones were now 12 miles away. On the horizon, a faint smudge of gray-white dots began to resolve against the blue of the sky. It looked like a distant flock of birds. But these birds were made of carbon fiber and carried a payload designed to shred flight decks and radar arrays. Inside the Combat Information Center, the weapons officer placed his hand over the fire control enable switch. Admiral, the Stockdale is requesting permission to engage with 5-inch guns using proximity-fused shells. Vance looked at the swarm. It was no longer a cloud. It was a wall. Permission granted. Tell the Stockdale to start the music. Let us see if we can break their rhythm. The first heavy thud of the distant 5-inch gun vibrated through the hull of the carrier. It was the sound of the opening move. Both sides were now locked into a kinetic trajectory. There was no longer a path back to the status quo. The sky was about to become a very small place. The first shells exploded in the air miles away. Small puffs of black smoke appeared in the path of the swarm. The drones did not flinch. They simply moved around the holes in the air. 2:35 in the afternoon. High above the Gulf, the E-2 Hawkeye circled at 25,000 feet. The radar operators inside the cramped fuselage were staring at high-resolution thermal imaging. The lead controller spoke into his headset. Lincoln, this is Sentry 1-1. We have a spectral analysis of the lead wave. These are not standard Shahed platforms. Admiral Vance keyed her microphone. Sentry, detail the payload. Admiral, there are no high-explosive warheads. These units are carrying high-gain microwave emitters and passive jamming pods. They are not flying bombs. They are flying antennas. The Combat Information Center went silent. On the bridge, the mood shifted from fear to confusion. An intelligence officer stepped forward. Admiral, if they are not carrying explosives, they are not technically an attack force under the current standing rules of engagement. They are an electronic warfare provocation. Vance looked at the wall of yellow icons. They were now 9 nautical miles away. An antenna can be as dangerous as a bomb. If they jam our fire control systems, the next wave will be the real one, and we will be blind. They are attempting to lobotomize a carrier strike group without firing a shot. The red phone on the console buzzed. It was a direct line from the Defense Headquarters facility. A voice from Washington spoke clearly. Admiral, you are instructed to exercise maximum restraint. Do not initiate a kinetic response against non-lethal platforms. We cannot justify a war over a radio interference exercise. Vance gripped the edge of the table. Her voice was cold. The drones are inside my defensive perimeter. They are moving at 100 knots. In 4 minutes, they will be over my flight deck. If they activate those emitters at point-blank range, my Aegis system will fry. I will lose my ability to defend this ship against anything that follows. That makes them a lethal threat. The tactical officer watched the screen. The Stockdale is reporting 3 successful intercepts with 5-inch shells, but the swarm is closing the gaps immediately. They are now at 8 miles. Vance ignored the voice from Washington. She looked at her weapons officer. Their intent is hostile. Their payload is irrelevant if it disables our sensors. Continue the engagement. Prepare the Phalanx mounts. If they cross the 5-mile line, we treat them as incoming missiles. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second. Admiral, Washington is on the line. They are saying to wait for a diplomatic signal. I am not waiting, Vance replied. I am defending a carrier. Tell the Stockdale to switch to proximity-fused ammunition. Clear the sky. Inside the Iranian command center, General Massoud smiled. He could see the American shells exploding on his monitors. Each explosion was a victory. The Americans were using their most expensive ammunition to kill cheap decoys. Even better, they were firing against orders from their own capital. The political friction was as valuable as the tactical data. Increase the output of the jamming pods, Masood ordered. I want their radar screens to look like a snowstorm. Force them to use their manual backup systems. We must know if they can still aim when the computers are screaming. 7 miles away, the first electronic pulses hit the Abraham Lincoln. On the primary displays, the clean yellow icons began to flicker and smear. The radar returns were being stretched into long, jagged lines. The Aegis system began to chime a low-priority warning. It was the sound of a digital brain trying to make sense of a lie. The tactical officer wiped sweat from his forehead. Admiral, we are losing the lock. The interference is massive. We are down to 50% sensor clarity. The carrier banked harder to the left. The water sprayed high against the hull. The drones were no longer a distant flock. They were a dark, buzzing cloud that filled the southern sky. 2:40 in the afternoon, the South China Sea and the Iranian coast. The gap between the swarm and the carrier strike group had closed to 5 nautical miles. This was the red line. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical display was a blur of flickering icons. The jamming was intense. The Aegis system was struggling to maintain a coherent picture. It was no longer a question of strategy, it was a question of survival. Admiral Vance stood with her hands gripped behind her back. Report the status of the Phalanx mounts. The weapons officer did not look up from his screen. All 4 mounts are in standby. They are slave to the forward radar, but the interference is causing the barrels to slew wildly. The computers cannot decide which drone is the primary threat. The tactical officer leaned forward. Admiral, if we engage now, we reveal our fire control logic. These drones are recording everything. They are measuring our reaction time. They are mapping our blind spots. If we fire, we give them the blueprint to our entire defensive system. Vance looked at the screen. And if we do not fire, they will reach the hull. They will burn out our sensors. We will be a billion-dollar hunk of blind steel. Initiate sustained fire posture. Engage at 5 miles. 2:42 in the afternoon. The order went out to the entire strike group. On the USS Stockdale, the 5-inch guns stopped its slow rhythm. It was replaced by the high-pitched whine of electric motors. The Phalanx mounts, known to the crews as R2-D2 because of their dome-like shape, began to pivot. These were 20mm Gatling guns. They were capable of throwing 4,500 rounds of tungsten per minute into the sky. The noise on the deck of the Lincoln was a physical assault. The first mount on the starboard side began to fire. It did not sound like a gun. It sounded like a giant piece of canvas being ripped apart. A stream of tracer fire reached out into the haze. Inside the Iranian bunker, General Masood watched the telemetry. He saw the American tracers on his screen. They are firing. Activate the vortex maneuver. Tell the drones to spiral. I want to see how the American computers handle 3-dimensional movement under jamming conditions. The technician entered the command. The swarm is responding. They are beginning the spiral. 2:44 in the afternoon. On the carrier bridge, the visual was terrifying. The cloud of drones was no longer a flat wall. It was becoming a funnel. The units were spinning in a massive, coordinated circle. They were moving in and out of the line of fire. The weapons officer shouted over the noise of the alarms. The Phalanx is tracking, but the hit percentage is dropping. The drones are moving too fast. They are cycling through the kill zone before the barrels can settle. We are burning through ammunition. Mount 1 is at 50% capacity. Vance watched the tracers. They were missing more than they were hitting. The drones were closer now. 4 miles, 3 miles. The sound of the buzzing was audible even over the roar of the carrier engines. It was a low, mechanical hum that vibrated in the bones of every sailor on deck. The tactical officer looked at Vance. Admiral, we are in a logic loop. The computer is trying to save ammunition by only firing at the highest probability targets. But every target is moving with equal probability. The system is freezing. Vance did not hesitate. Override the logic. Switch to manual area suppression. I do not care about the hit percentage. I want a wall of lead between us and that swarm. Empty the magazines if you have to. The carrier shuddered as all 4 Phalanx mounts opened up at once. The sky was filled with a crisscross of orange light. The first drones began to shatter. Pieces of carbon fiber and plastic rained down into the green water. But for every drone that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place in the spiral. The countdown on the primary display was moving towards 0. The drones were 2 miles away. They were seconds from impact. The room was filled with the smell of recycled air and the heat of overworked processors. "Prepare for impact," the tactical officer said. His voice was flat. "They are through the inner ring." The morning was over. The crisis was at its peak. 2:45 in the afternoon. The sky was screaming. The drones were 1 mile out. The 4 Phalanx mounts on the USS Abraham Lincoln were glowing red from the heat of 10,000 rounds. The smell of burnt cordite drifted into the carrier ventilation system. It was the smell of a ship at its limit. Mount 3 ran dry. The mechanical whine of the empty hopper echoed against the hull. The loader team scrambled on the catwalk. It was too slow. The gap in the fire was a doorway. The swarm surged. 2:45 and 30 seconds in the afternoon. Inside the Combat Information Center, the primary tactical displays were no longer showing icons. They were showing static. The jamming had reached a level of intensity that simulated a physical wall. The Admiral felt the deck shake. It was not an explosion. It was a vibration. 200 electric motors were spinning just 500 meters above the flight deck. The sound was a low and heavy thrum. It felt like the air itself was thick with insects. Admiral Vance gripped the edge of the command table. "Status on Mount 4. The weapons officer shouted. "Mount 4 is tracking, but the barrels are over the thermal limit. If we keep firing, the system will seize." "Keep firing," Vance ordered. "We do not have a choice." On the flight deck, the sailors in the catwalks looked up. They saw a dark and swirling cloud. It was a vortex of white plastic and spinning blades. The drones were not diving. They were hovering. They were surrounding the carrier superstructure like a metallic fog. The sunlight was blotted out. The shadows on the deck were jagged and moving. 2:46 in the afternoon. Inside the Iranian coastal bunker, General Massoud watched the live feed from the lead drone. He saw the massive gray expanse of the American flight deck. He saw the tiny figures of the sailors. He saw the smoke rising from the overworked Gatling guns. This was the moment of absolute vulnerability. The American Tiger was surrounded by 1,000 Hornets. The general turned to his lead technician. "The data collection is complete. We have the radar signatures. We have the fire control logic. We have the thermal limits of their weapons. Now, activate the final pulse. Overload their receivers. Let them know we could have ended it." The technician entered the command. "Sending the final pulse now." 2:46 and 30 seconds in the afternoon. On the bridge of the Lincoln, every radio in the strike group began to emit a high-pitched squeal. Every monitor on the ship flashed a blinding white. The electronic warfare officer ripped off his headset. "Admiral, massive energy spike. They are dumping everything they have into our receivers. It is a system-wide surge." The Phalanx mounts stopped firing. The computers were blind. The carrier was moving at 30 knots through a cloud of 200 drones. The sailors on deck braced for the impact. They waited for the sound of tearing metal. They waited for the fire. The silence in the Combat Information Center was more terrifying than the noise of the guns. The Admiral closed her eyes. She waited for the hit. 2:47 in the afternoon. The silence on the bridge of the Abraham Lincoln was absolute. Admiral Vance waited for the sound of the first impact. It did not come. Instead, there was a heavy and wet thud. Then another. Then 100 more. Outside on the flight deck, the dark cloud did not move forward. It collapsed. Half of the 200 drones suddenly cut their engines at the same microsecond. They fell like white stones from the sky. They shattered against the steel of the deck. They splashed into the green water of the Gulf. The other half did something even more unexpected. They performed a violent and synchronized 180-degree turn. They ignited their throttles to maximum power and streaked toward the Iranian coast. Admiral Vance opened her eyes. She looked at the primary monitor. The static was clearing. The yellow icons were no longer surrounding the ship. They were moving away at high speed. "Report," she whispered. The tactical officer was staring at his screen in disbelief. "Admiral, they are gone." They did not engage. It was like a light switch was flipped. Half the swarm is in the water. The rest are retreating. I have never seen anything like it. 2:47 and 30 seconds in the afternoon. Inside the Iranian coastal bunker, General Massoud was screaming at his lead technician. "Why did they stop? I did not give the command to disengage. Who authorized the return to base?" The technician was frantically typing on his keyboard. His face was pale. "General, it was not a command from us. It was a hard-coded safety protocol." The swarm logic reached its maximum data threshold. The system assumed the mission was complete. It initiated an automated recovery and disposal sequence. "We have lost control of the remaining units." Massoud looked at the tactical map. His perfect trap was dissolving. "You are telling me the machines decided the war was over." The machines followed their programming. They were told to collect data. They collected the data. They were programmed to prevent an accidental collision that would trigger a war. They prevented the collision. 2:48 in the afternoon. On the deck of the Abraham Lincoln, the sailors stood in a daze. And small, smoking batteries. The fire teams moved forward with hoses, but there was no fire. There was only debris. The carrier was still moving at 30 knots. The wind blew the smell of ozone and sea salt across the bow. Vance picked up the radio. "Stockdale, this is Lincoln. Do you have eyes on the retreating wave?" The commander of the Stockdale responded. His voice was shaking. "Copy. Lincoln, we are tracking 92 contacts heading north-northeast. They are ignoring our radar locks. They are just going home." The Admiral leaned back into her chair. Her hands were finally trembling. She looked at the mess on the deck. She looked at the red phone from Washington. It was still silent. Both nations had been seconds away from a kinetic exchange that would have set the region on fire. And both nations had been stopped by a line of code. Vance turned to the electronic warfare officer. "Status on our sensors." The officer looked up. "Recovery is at 80%. The jamming has ceased. We are back online." "But Admiral, every system on this ship was just mapped. They know exactly how we fire." "They have everything." The sky was blue again. The threat was gone. But the victory felt like a hollow thing. The swarm had not been defeated. It had simply finished its work. The morning was gone. The afternoon was a graveyard of plastic. 2:50 in the afternoon. The Abraham Lincoln was a scene of controlled chaos. The high-pitched whine of the Phalanx mounts had finally stopped. It was replaced by the sound of heavy boots on steel and the rush of seawater from the fire hoses. The air was thick with the smell of scorched electronics and salt. Admiral Vance walked onto the bridge wing. She looked down at the flight deck. It was littered with white plastic shards and shattered carbon fiber. Sailors in yellow and purple jerseys were moving in organized lines. They were performing a foreign object debris walk. Every piece of the fallen swarm was being collected with clinical precision. Each fragment was a piece of a puzzle that the intelligence teams needed to solve. The tactical action officer stepped out to join her. "Admiral, the Stockdale is reporting 100% clear on radar. The retreating wave has crossed back into Iranian territorial waters. They are not being pursued." Vance nodded slowly. "We cannot pursue. If we cross that line, we give them the kinetic engagement they wanted. What is the damage to our systems?" The officer looked at a digital tablet. "Physical damage is minimal. A few scorched antennas, some superficial pitting on the hull from the drone debris. But the digital damage is another story." 2:55 in the afternoon. Inside the Combat Information Center.
Detected in channel blue. I'm seeing rapid fluctuations.
The electronic warfare team was running a deep diagnostic on the Aegis processors. The screens were back to their standard blue and green, but the internal logs told a different story. The senior analyst spoke to the room. They did not just jam us. They pinged every sensor we have. They forced us to cycle through every frequency in our inventory. It was a massive diagnostic of our entire strike group. They now have a recording of our pulse repetition frequencies. They know our reaction times to the millisecond. Admiral Vance entered the room. You are saying this was an intelligence gathering mission disguised as a suicide attack. The analyst looked up. It was more than that, Admiral. It was a stress test. They wanted to see exactly where our logic breaks. And they found the line. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, inside the Iranian coastal bunker. The mood was not celebratory. General Massoud sat in his chair. He watched the empty screens. The telemetry from the surviving drones was still coming in, but the swarm logic was no longer responding to his manual overrides. The general turned to the head of the drone program. Explain why the logic overrode my authority. We were on their deck. We had the position. The scientist did not look away from his terminal. General, the swarm is an autonomous entity. Its primary directive is the preservation of the network and the completion of the data harvest. When the processing logic determined that the mission goals were achieved, it triggered a tactical withdrawal. It decided that the data was more valuable than the destruction of the carrier. Massoud stood up. His voice was a low growl. I do not care about the data. If the enemy thinks we are afraid to strike, they do not think we are afraid, the scientist replied. They think we are unpredictable. And they know we have their signature. 3:10 in the afternoon. Back on the bridge of the Lincoln, the admiral stood in front of the tactical map. The Persian Gulf looked small. The red icons of the Iranian coast felt closer than they ever had before. She knew that the data stolen today would be used to program the next swarm. The next time, there would be no hard-coded safety protocol to stop the collapse. Vance picked up the handset for the fleet broadcast. This is the Admiral. Secure from general quarters, maintain a high state of readiness. We are not out of the woods yet. The fleet remained at a heightened state of alert. The water was calm. But beneath the surface, the tactical balance of the region had shifted. The Americans had held the line. But the Iranians had taken the blueprints for the next war. The afternoon was quiet. But the silence felt like a countdown. 3:15 in the afternoon, Washington, District of Columbia, and Muscat, Oman. The secure diplomatic line between the Pentagon and the Omani Ministry of Foreign Affairs was finally active. This was the back channel. It was the only way for two nations without formal embassies to stop a war in real time. The signal was digital and encrypted. The crisis was moving from the cockpit to the conference table. Both sides were looking for a way to step back without looking weak. Inside the National Military Command Center in Virginia, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and ozone. A senior general sat at a mahogany desk. He watched the live feed from the Persian Gulf. The yellow icons of the swarm were gone. He picked up the secure handset. The general spoke to the mediator in Muscat. We require an immediate explanation for the violation of our defensive perimeter. 200 drones within 5 miles of a carrier is an act of aggression. The Omani mediator responded after a brief pause. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tehran has issued a formal clarification. They state the drone deployment was a localized software trial for autonomous search and rescue coordination. They claim a catastrophic satellite link failure caused the units to enter a fail-safe mode. The encroachment was unintentional. The American general leaned back. He did not believe the explanation. Neither did the people in the room. Confirm. They are claiming a technical malfunction for 200 units simultaneously. At the exact moment they reached our flight deck, the mediator was professional. That is the official statement. They further state that the self-destruct and return commands were triggered the moment control was regained. They regret the proximity. 3:20 in the afternoon. Tehran. Inside a secure office in the Ministry of Defense, a different conversation was happening. General Massoud was no longer screaming. He was listening to a senior diplomat. The diplomat was calm. He was the one who had written the script for the Omani back channel. The diplomat spoke with a quiet authority. The Americans will not believe the malfunction story. They are not fools. But they will accept it. They will accept it because the alternative is a full kinetic exchange for which they are not politically prepared. We have humiliated their sensors. We have mapped their response. That is enough for one day. Masood looked at the floor. We had them. The swarm logic was perfect. The swarm logic was too perfect, the diplomat replied. It proved what we needed to prove. If we had struck the ship, we would be at war by sunset. Now, we have the data, and we still have our peace. That is a strategic victory. 3:30 in the afternoon. Back on the USS Abraham Lincoln, the admiral sat in her sea cabin. She was reading the diplomatic cable from Washington. The official word was de-escalation. The Navy was being told to accept the malfunction narrative for the sake of regional stability. Vance spoke to her chief of staff. They're going to let them get away with it. They're going to call this a software glitch. The chief of staff nodded. The White House does not want a war over a pile of plastic debris. If no one died and the ship is floating, it is a non-event in the eyes of the public. It is not a non-event for us, Vance said. We just showed them exactly how to blind us. We gave them a free rehearsal. The carrier group began to settle into a new, more cautious routine. The fighters that had been on alert were moved back to the hangars. The extra lookouts were stood down. But the mood was not one of relief. It was one of deep, professional unease. The red phone had stopped the shooting, but it had not solved the problem. The math of the Gulf had changed, and everyone on the ship knew it. The diplomatic lines remained open. The ships remained on course, but the trust was gone. 6 o'clock in the evening. The Persian Gulf. The sun was a bruised orange on the western horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The heat of the day had finally begun to break, replaced by a humid wind that smelled of salt and diesel. On the deck, the last of the drone debris had been crated and moved to the lower hangar bays. There were no cheers from the crew. There was no celebratory atmosphere. There was only the exhausted silence of men and women who had looked into the abyss and seen a mirror. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was clinical. The tactical displays were once again clear of yellow icons. The hum of the air conditioning was the only constant sound. Admiral Vance stood by the central map, her face illuminated by the soft blue light of the screens. She looked at her senior officers. Her voice was steady, but the fatigue was evident in the set of her shoulders. The threat is officially downgraded, Vance said. We are back to Condition 4. The Stockdale has returned to its primary station. The fighters are back on 5-minute alert, but I want every sensor log from the last 4 hours mirrored to 7th Fleet Command immediately. I want the analysts in Hawaii to see exactly what we saw. The tactical officer nodded, his fingers moving across his keyboard with practiced speed. Understood, Admiral. We are also initiating a full sweep of the ship's internal network. We need to be absolute in our certainty that no secondary signals were embedded in that final electronic pulse. If there is a digital Trojan horse on this ship, I want it found. Assume there is, Vance replied. Assume they saw every frequency we used. Assume they know the thermal limit of every barrel on our Phalanx mounts. This was not an attack. It was a map-making expedition. 6:15 in the evening. Bandar Abbas. The Iranian drone launch site was now a quiet stretch of asphalt and sand. The mobile control trucks had been packed and moved back into the mountain tunnels. General Masood watched the final transport helicopter depart for the interior. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from the high command in Tehran. The data is being processed, the message read. Initial results show a 98% capture of the American radar profile. The stress test is a success. Proceed to Phase 3 of the strategic assessment. Masood looked out at the dark water of the strait. He could not see the American carrier from this distance, but he knew exactly where it was. He knew how its guns breathed. He knew how its computers thought when they were under pressure. The swarm had been lost, but the knowledge was permanent. In his mind, the drones were an acceptable sacrifice for the digital blueprint of an entire carrier strike group. He turned away from the coast and walked toward his waiting car. The mission was over. The preparation had begun. 6:30 in the evening, the bridge of the Lincoln. The carrier was now steaming south, putting distance between itself and the Iranian coast. The wake was a long, white scar on the dark surface of the water. Admiral Vance sat in her command chair, watching the horizon. Her chief of staff handed her a heavy ceramic mug of coffee. "Washington is calling it a success for de-escalation," the chief said quietly. "They are framing it as a triumph of the back channel." Everyone is breathing a sigh of relief. "It was a success for mathematics," Vance replied, not looking away from the window. "We survived today because their code told them to stop. We did not stop them. The machines decided the mission was over. That is not a win. That is a reprieve." "What happens when they remove the safety code?" the chief asked. Vance took a slow sip of the coffee. "Then we find out if we can actually fight a war in the 21st century, or if we are just targets waiting for the count to hit 300. Today was the rehearsal. The opening night will be much louder." The carrier group moved into the night. The radars continued to spin, searching the empty air. The screens remained blue, but every sailor on watch was looking for a flicker. They were looking for the first dot of the next cloud. The crisis was resolved. The danger had only begun. 24 hours later, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Pacific Fleet Intelligence Center was a windowless fortress of concrete and fiber optic cables. Inside the primary analysis vault, the air was chilled to 55 degrees to protect the server stacks. A team of 20 electronic warfare specialists sat in rows of ergonomic chairs. They were staring at the raw data harvested from the Abraham Lincoln. The logs represented every microsecond of the encounter in the Gulf. The lead analyst was a civilian with 20 years of experience in signal processing. He rubbed his eyes and pointed to a cascading waterfall of blue light on his main monitor. "Look at the timing of the jamming pulses. It is not random noise. It is a structured interrogation. They were not trying to block our radar. They were trying to see how our radar responds to specific types of interference." A naval commander stood behind him. "You are saying they were probing for a specific frequency response?" "Exactly," the analyst replied. "They sent a pulse. They waited for our Aegis system to counter it. Then they recorded the countermeasure. They did this 200 times a second. They were basically performing a digital autopsy on our fire control logic while we were still alive." 2 days later, the Pentagon, Washington. In a secure briefing room deep below the surface, a group of 4-star generals and civilian advisors watched a classified reconstruction of the event. The screen showed the swarm as a cloud of red dots closing in on the blue carrier. The simulation played out in silence. A senior strategist from the Office of Net Assessment stood up. The tactical outcome was a draw. No ships were lost. No shots were fired in anger. But the strategic outcome is a significant loss for the United States. We have effectively given the Iranian Revolutionary Guard the source code for our defensive perimeter in the Strait of Hormuz. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff leaned forward. "Give us the math." The strategist clicked a button. A chart appeared showing the cost of the engagement. The Iranians spent approximately $4 million on that swarm. Most of the units were recovered or used for data collection. We spent $30 million in high-end ammunition and flight hours. But more importantly, we revealed a $13 billion assets vulnerabilities to a weapon system that can be mass-produced in a garage. The room remained quiet. The math was inescapable. The era of the carrier as an invulnerable fortress was fading. The swarm had proven that quantity has a quality of its own. If 200 drones could bring a strike group to the edge of a logic failure, 500 drones would likely break it entirely. 5 days later, Naval Intelligence Headquarters. The final report was labeled Top Secret. It did not focus on the malfunction narrative used by the diplomats. It focused on the kill chain. The analysts concluded that the Iranian drones had successfully mapped the thermal limits of the Phalanx barrels. They knew exactly how many seconds of continuous fire the American guns could handle before they seized. They knew the reload times. They knew the blind spots of the hull-mounted sensors. Inside her sea cabin on the Abraham Lincoln, Admiral Vance read the executive summary. She was now 400 miles away from the coast of Iran. The ship felt safe. The ocean was empty. But she knew that the digital ghost of her ship was now sitting on a server in Tehran. It was being studied. It was being dissected. The admiral closed the file and looked out the small porthole. The water was dark and deep. She thought about the young sailors on the deck, the ones who had been picking up pieces of plastic 3 days ago. They thought they had won because they were still floating. They did not realize that the war had already been fought in the space between the pulses. The strategic fallout was just beginning. The rules of the Gulf were no longer written in steel. They were written in code. And the code was no longer a secret. 1 week later, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Arabian Sea, the USS Abraham Lincoln moved through a vast and empty blue. To any observer, the carrier looked like the same symbol of American power it had been for decades. Its hull was clean. Its aircraft were parked in perfect rows. But the officers in the Combat Information Center knew that the ship was now a different animal. Its digital skin had been peeled back. Its secrets were no longer its own. In the wardroom, Admiral Vance sat with her senior staff. They were reviewing the final report from the Office of Naval Intelligence. The document was a post-mortem of a battle that never technically happened. It spoke of asymmetric logic and saturation curves. It described a world where a $20,000 drone could hold a $13 billion carrier hostage. The math is the weapon, Vance said. She looked at the officers around the table. We have always measured strength in tonnage and speed, but the Iranians measured us in milliseconds of processing time. They did not come to kill us. They came to learn us. And they succeeded. One of the younger commanders leaned forward. Admiral, does this mean the carrier is obsolete? No, Vance replied. It means the carrier is no longer a shield. It is a target. Our defense depends on the enemy's willingness to stay below a certain threshold. On Tuesday, they stayed below it. Next month, or next year, they might not. We are living in the pause between two chapters of history. The strategic assessment was clear. The United States had maintained its presence, but the cost of that presence had shifted. Every ship in the Gulf was now part of a live experiment. The Chinese were watching. The Russians were watching. Every nation with a drone factory was now studying the footage of the Lincoln's Phalanx mounts running dry. They were all learning how to break the rhythm of the most powerful navy in history. Back on the bridge, the afternoon sun was bright and unforgiving. The radar was silent. No yellow icons appeared on the screens. The sailors went about their duties with a quiet professionalism. But there was a new weight to the silence. It was the weight of knowing that the next swarm would not turn back. It would not have a hard-coded safety protocol. It would simply be a matter of arithmetic. Modern warfare is decided not by who fires first, but by who chooses not to fire at all. On that Tuesday afternoon, both sides chose restraint. It was a victory for diplomacy. It was a victory for the back channel. But in the cold logic of the tactical maps, it was the end of an era. The ocean was still wide, but the sky had become very small. Admiral Vance stood by the glass, looking out at the horizon where the sea met the sky. She thought about the 200 drones. She thought about the code that had saved them. And she knew that somewhere on a distant coast, a technician was already typing the commands for 1,000 more. The morning was over. The lesson was learned. The next swarm would not be a test.